Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Spencer, and I'm the project coordinator at the Simpson Center for Agricultural and Food Innovation and Public Education, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Thanks for all of you to join us. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical research and for bringing people together to discuss the important issues with experts, which is what we're here to do today. If you have to leave early, just a reminder, there are recordings of all of our webinars posted on the School of Public Policy website, and you will receive a follow-up link after our session today to that policy site, or to that webinar site. And just a reminder of our format today, our speaker will present, and then you will have a chance to give her questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will pose them to our speaker after the discussion. Today's presentation will be a sneak peek of our author's soon-to-be published paper from the Simpson Center for Agricultural and Food Innovation and Public Education on Canadian agri-food export opportunities in a COVID-19 world. Our speaker today is May Yeung. May is an economist and analyst with over 25 years of experience in economic research, analysis, and assessment, focusing upon international economics, regulatory and trade policy issues, and particularly in agriculture and the agri-food areas. She is also a U of C grad, in addition to holding an MBA from the University of Wales, and is an affiliate of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan currently. The paper we're discussing today was co-authored by May and Dr. Bill Kerr, Distinguished Professor at the College of Agriculture and Bioresources at the University of Saskatchewan. And now I will hand it over to you, May.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Karen. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And where's my PowerPoint? Here it is. Share. Okay, good. Okay, so today I'm going to speak with you a bit about Canada's opportunities in a COVID-19 world. There is a chance that we can actually take this as an opportunity to have some positives in a very negative world, given all the shocks that have come. So, oops, why is this not? Okay, here we go. So we are still in the middle of the pandemic, and we have still seen what has happened in our food supply chain since the pandemic began. And most agricultural policy experts would agree that the Canadian food supply chain has actually proven to be highly resilient in the face of COVID-19. And keeping in mind that agriculture is a unique industry because it is biological. Once you plant a seed, you can't stop it from growing. Once a baby animal, a hog or a calf is born, you can't tell it to stop growing. So our food and agri-food systems are based on biological processes that can't be stopped and can't be shifted and can't be stalled. They can't make instantaneous adjustments. Everything, if it needs change, requires time. And our system also is split between consumer goods and food service and restaurants. And those two supply chains are not perfectly fungible. An egg is an egg, but an egg meant for a consumer at Sobeys is packaged, distributed, labeled, and transported totally differently than it would be if it was going for the restaurant trade. So to shift things back and forth, it takes time to adapt. And COVID-19 threw two types of shocks at the system simultaneously. One was the demand side when the lockdowns came and everybody started to eat at home. And so grocery supplies and grocery demands increased exponentially. While at the same time, everybody stopped eating out or flying or going to restaurants or any sort of food service. So the demand on that side completely imploded. So those kinds of shortages were complete shocks that had never been seen before at the same time concurrently. But the good news was at the grocery stores, when these things were happening and while we were trying to adapt, there were always substitutes available at the store. So even though that cut of side ribs of pork or beef weren't available, there was always a different source of protein. If that particular type of pasta wasn't available, there was another source of carbohydrate. So in fact, there were shortages, but in fact, food security was never actually threatened, which is a good sign in terms of how resilient our food chains were. And if you look at it now, they've adapted. Everything's pretty much available. Prices haven't gone through the roof yet. And so we have seen how resilient the Canadian food supply chain has been. And that is not to say there were not systemic problems. We saw how asparagus was left to rot in the fields in Ontario because they couldn't get seasonal workers to come harvest. We have seen how livestock have been held back at farms and producers and ranchers because there have been no, the shortages and shutdowns and processing capacity meant that livestock couldn't move through the supply chain like they were supposed to and scheduled. And the farmers are now holding them and feeding them. And because of an oversupply, they're also coming down in price. So this is not to say that there are no problems. There are, but generally our systems were able to cope given sufficient time. And in fact, the impact of COVID-19 actually had less severe impacts than we initially feared, particularly in terms of moving food around. So much of our supply chains for food and agriculture come up through the US, and we were able to still receive our shipments. Trucking, rail, transport, ports, everything seemed to still work, which was a big fear for most policy analysts. There was large concerns that would actually stop, and that would be a huge problem for our supply chains. So overall, so far, the North American just-in-time model has proven vulnerable to short-run disruptions, but it is responsive and can adapt given sufficient time. So why is this resiliency important? Well, world population is projected to increase. And no matter what happens, people and livestock still need to eat. And you're also looking at the next billion people who are about to enter the middle class. 88% of those will be from Asia. And as people enter the middle class, they also want a more diverse and broader range of food to choose from for their diets. So these are just some of the numbers of what's actually going to happen in terms of demand in the next decade alone. And Canada enjoys a very unique position. There are not many countries that have this status. We're actually a large net exporter of all types of food. There's a very limited group that can do this. So that actually shows us growth opportunities for increasing Canadian exports of food. So why is this important? Oops, why is this not working? Sorry. There we go. So how will COVID-19 affect world food trade? Well, it's not great news. We're looking at a global recession for 2020 and probably 2021. Economic growth is about to shrink between 2 and 5%. But again, people and livestock still need to eat. And agriculture and agri-food is somewhat insulated. This was shown in 2008 and the Great Recession in 2008, when agriculture and agri-food was not nearly as badly impacted as manufacturing, fuel, or mining. So because again, the unique status of being a biological thing, everybody still needs to eat. So there's still going to be trade and a demand for agriculture. There will be changes in what's actually demanded as consumers change their behaviors according to their income levels. So with a recession, incomes will decline and consumers will likely choose staples over higher priced options. And they will assess their budgets according to their personal situations. What governments do during COVID-19 and this pandemic will also affect how trade will operate. Currently, there are some export restrictions on wheat in the Black Sea region, which will actually increase demand for wheat while there's a reduced supply. So that's actually good news for Canadian exporters of wheat, but not so good for food insecure developing countries who also need wheat. Argentina is unique in that it implemented an export tax on wheat, but that was pre-COVID. That was a domestic policy initiative, but they could actually increase that tax in response to COVID. So we don't know what they're going to do. Countries could also implement protectionist policies under and use COVID-19 phytosanitary regulations or health regulations as an excuse. And as always, political agendas also affect what countries do in terms of their trade policies, as you can see with China. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Why? Okay. So how does COVID-19 actually affect agriculture and agri-food trade? Well, because we have no other tools, everybody is using lockdowns, social distancing, and to manage this, but it also has economic ramifications, which means economic damage. And depending on how the fiscal capacity of the country and the health economy prior to the pandemic. So can the government actually support consumers who are all suddenly thrown out of work? Can they adapt their economies to ride out the shutdowns and lockdowns? Is it a primarily agrarian economy? Is it primarily mechanized? Is it sufficiently sophisticated in its infrastructure to manage how COVID will move through populations? And again, how they manage the outbreaks and lockdowns will also affect how agri-food trade will be affected. So COVID actually just destroys the labor in supply chains. That is the weak link that COVID will attack. And it causes labor displacement in food production, processing, any aspect where people are involved. So if workers are staying at home because they're told to, or they become sick, or we can't access temporary foreign workers because the borders are closed, any labor intensive link in a food supply chain is going to be vulnerable to COVID-19. And so far, we have seen that it's mostly in food processing and distribution, and possibly in transport. There's also been the issue of the thickening of the border to access seasonal workers and foreign temporary workers who couldn't come in, either because they couldn't come in time, or they weren't allowed in, or they had to quarantine for 2 weeks, which actually slows down the whole purpose of their arriving, whether it be harvesting or planting or maintenance. And there was also concerns about food transport thickening in terms of truckers coming across who bring so much of our produce back and forth, and a lot of our agri-food products, but that didn't seem to be an issue. We have not heard of any issues in the trucking industry or in rail even. So that's been promising. So agriculture can actually make a huge contribution to Canada's post-pandemic economic recovery, and actually increase our global share of agri-food trade and exports. Why? Because Canada, again, like I mentioned before, is one of the largest global agri-food exporters. But before the pandemic, we were competitive and efficient. It is a huge industry. 50% of Canadian food production is exported. We employ over 250,000 people, and we actually ship all over the world, all sorts of products all over the world. So how do we leverage this kind of status into something that can contribute to our economic recovery during this coming recession? There is a 4-part strategy from 2 perspectives. The 2 perspectives are domestic and international. So firstly, domestically within Canada, we have to maintain our outbreak control and control of COVID-19. So continue to successfully mitigate it within the population, continue to flatten the curve, and therefore reduce the economic effects of COVID-19 on labor and in industries and businesses. So prevent labor shortages, prevent the bottlenecks. And then in that way, we can also help protect our agri-food supply chains. So ensure workers are safe within processing facilities, ensure drivers are safe in transportation, prevent the bottlenecks in trucking, rail, and at ports. Canada is a really, really large country that is held together by a huge network of rail and truck and highways to get to ports. As long as those are functioning, we can prevent bottlenecks there. And that includes allowing green lanes, which actually what we did for the trucking industry. And they were allowed to keep goods and services flowing that way. And one final thing there is to resist policy responses that might have a negative effect on already resilient agri-food supply chains. So don't try and tinker with existing policy programs now during a pandemic as a knee-jerk reaction. So those are the domestic perspectives. Internationally, Canada should monitor the status of COVID within our competitor nations that are producing the same types of commodities that we produce. Assess what they're doing in their supply chains. See how COVID is moving through their populations and their workforces. How much labor is there? How much mechanization is prevalent in that supply chain? How reliant on manual labor? How reliant are they on labor in terms of timing? Something, for instance, Ecuador needs bananas, Ecuador ships bananas, but bananas need harvesting by hand every day. So that is a weak link for COVID to attack and makes the country vulnerable in that way. So these kind of assessments are important to see what's going on in terms of COVID. The less successful an industry within a competitor is at mitigating COVID, they are going to experience those same labor shortages and processing bottlenecks and slowdowns that we don't want. So if their supply chain is less resilient, they are probably not going to be able to produce or export in the same sort of volume or quality that they're supposed to or hoping to. And also we need to monitor what other governments are doing in terms of supporting their industries during COVID. Are they providing financing? Are they implementing import or export taxes or tariffs or barriers? And see what they're doing in terms of their immigration and labor policies. Are they allowing more workers in to make up for the shortcomings in the domestic workforce? Are they implementing export restrictions? These kind of things. So how is this in practice? This is a quick summary of what I'm speaking about. It just gives you a visual of how this is going to work. And how is this going to apply in real life? Well, the research for this was done back in May and April. So we've had some time to actually see what's resulted. Now, if you look at beef and meat exports, so in Canada in mid-April, Cargill and JBS in High River had a large outbreak, which at the time was the largest outbreak in Canada, with 1,400 workers and related people within their vicinity infected. The plants were closed for 2 weeks. They ran with, and then they reduced production for when they returned to work. And now, by the end of June, had pretty much returned to full capacity. These two plants process 70% of Canadian beef. And as of the end of June, there were only 2 cases and no new outbreaks. So it looks like we have actually managed COVID-19 very well in our meat processing industry. If you look at what's going on in the US right now, which is one of our largest competitors and integrated in our beef processing chain, you can see that the US is a global leader in infections and death. 10% of Tyson Foods' workforce has been infected, and it probably significantly higher percentage. They are underreporting infection rates because they're actually not testing, and they're not reporting when these outbreaks are actually occurring in the plants in some of the states. So when I first did the research in May, they were predicting that by July, that they would only be running at 10 to 15% with reduced capacity by July. So they were just coming back online. President Trump had actually just designated meat slaughterhouse staff as essential workers, and they were hoping to be at just 10 to 15% processing capacity less. But in fact, now, by the end of June, they are at 50% capacity. So they've lost 50%. And they're predicting that there will be meat shortages in the US. So, and then if you look at Brazil, who is the world's largest beef and chicken exporter and the 4th largest in pork exports, they too also have hotspots in meat processing and slaughterhouses, 2nd in the world in COVID infections and deaths. So they have nearly 500 facilities with 2,000 workers each. And they have been the largest meat supplier to China for the last few years. They have 17 of 25 export licenses for beef, 6 for poultry, 1 for pork. And just recently, at the beginning of July, China has halted imports from 2 more Brazil plants amongst COVID-19 worries. So that gives you a scenario where 2 major competitors of ours are having problems with COVID. And we are mitigating it very well within our own industry. That could be an export opportunity for us to make up for the shortfalls in those two exporters. If you want to look at another case of pulses and legumes, we have had no incidents of COVID or issues within production or processing. Mitigation strategies are in place. And we've had a good year. There's been increased seeding and acreage. There's been significant demand and shipments. And China has been our largest export market, and India is second. And within our top six destination export markets, Canada is the largest supplier in value in each of them. Australia is a significant competitor to us in pulses and legumes again, and they are also in the same situation we are, where they've been able to manage COVID-19 well. There's no issues in the supply chain for pulses and legumes. They've also had the end of a severe drought, so they've had a good year for planting. They tend to ship to Southeast Asia, and they also share a similar planting and harvest season with the Indian subcontinent, whereas we're opposite. So that's promising for both of us. And if you look at India, they are second in COVID-19 infections and fifth in deaths. They are the world's largest pulse consumer, producer, and importer, but they are not self-sufficient. They need to import. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the Indian government implemented pandemic rations, of which pulses are a significant portion. And their supply chains are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 labor shortages, because although there are some aspects that are highly mechanized, everything that's moved and shipped in India is done by hand. So the unloading and loading of rail cars and trucks and ships is actually done by hand. So there's a weak link there for COVID-19 to make vulnerable supply chains in India. And India actually imposed import restrictions in 2017 because they wanted to improve their own domestic production of pulses. And they've just reduced the tariffs now because they realize that they need to import. So that is also a promising export opportunity for Canadian pulse growers. Why is this not going? Okay, so this is not directly related to COVID-19, but there is a bit of a caveat here. So in terms of barley, we've had, again, like pulses, no problems, processing's going well, production's going well, good supplies, good orders. And in fact, for Canadian barley growers, we've doubled our exports from April to May, and there's been significant interest from China, particularly in malting barley and the remainder in feed. And again, we compete with Australia for barley again, and they are also in good shape in terms of COVID-19, but they are China's largest supplier of barley, providing 42% of all their imports. However, in the spring of this year, China imposed an 80% tariff on their largest supplier of barley, basically shutting off Australia as a supplier. And if you look at the situation in China, what happened was they had a huge outbreak of Asian swine flu, which decimated their domestic hog population. And that meant their demand for barley as feed also declined significantly. Now that is expected to rebound as they rebuild their herd. They also have a high demand for malting barley for beer. And they also have a trade agreement with the US, but that is also complicated by trade friction with the US. So you don't know what's going to happen there. And China has a history of using trade as a political tool and unilaterally imposing bans or tariffs on Canadian beef, Canadian pork, canola, and just recently Australian barley. Or they use heightened trade measures enforcement. So perhaps they were a little more lenient on some of their regulations, and now they've tightened up. So Canadian soy and peas has experienced that too. So just as a slight caveat, yes, China is a huge market. China has a growing population and a growing middle-class consumer base, and they need imported food. They need to have exports from all sorts of countries everywhere. But there is always a risk in dealing with China. Okay, so what about Canadian supply chains in the wake of COVID-19? Well, they've shown that they are resilient. In If it isn't broken, don't fix it. The pandemic did illustrate existing policy weaknesses. We had shortages of foreign and temporary workers, which delayed harvest and planting. The issue of livestock being held back has actually been just a huge impact on producers and ranchers, their income as they hold back livestock from processing. And that is still going on because they haven't caught up yet at the processing facilities. And that backlog is going to take a long time to catch up. And in the meantime, farmers and ranchers are left feeding livestock and holding them for and we'll be able to sell them for a much reduced price. So that is an issue that is still ongoing. And there were problems. We're not saying that there weren't problems, but overall, the resiliency of our supply chains worked. Food was continuously available with plentiful substitutes in aggregate. So there was no threat to food security. Governments should resist intervening in the wake of short-run COVID-19 difficulties, because policies that are done with knee-jerk reactions during this short run will eventually reduce competitiveness and do not actually improve domestic food security. And that will actually encumber our supply chains with regulations that will constrain their resiliency. And that's what we need to preserve, is resiliency. Another pandemic is probably going to come, but it will probably not be an exact replica of COVID-19. So if we implement policies that are exactly designed to deal with COVID-19, they won't be the ones that are needed when the next pandemic comes. We just have to enable supply chains to react and use that resiliency to bounce back to the next threat. And there's opportunity there. So Canadian supply chains were efficient and competitive before the pandemic, and they still are. So let them act on new opportunities on their own as they come up. What we can do is help them facilitate resiliency. Find out what's going on by conducting effective research, monitor what's happening in our foreign markets, in our competitors, find out what's happening in terms of COVID-19 and how they're coping, and see what opportunities we can find. So overall policy and implications: enable and facilitate clear and open international supply chains. Avoid efficiency reducing constraints. We need to prepare and plan for another pandemic, but not exactly a replica of COVID-19. Let supply chains do their thing by becoming resilient and staying resilient. Address the known failures that COVID-19 has shown us. So improve access to seasonal work and temporary foreign workers in a timely, easy manner, and also provide income protection for producers caught in supply chain disruptions, like our livestock and hog producers, as well as horticultural producers. It was decimating for them, but in the short run, and in the long run, they should be able to adapt given income protection in the future. Assist the supply chains, monitor competitors, monitor export markets, see what's going on out there, be eyes and ears, assess what current and potential future markets there are, and fund research into opportunities. And overall, as always, support a rules-based international trade system and its institutions. So resist using trade as a political tool, resist going it alone, although that is quite complicated in this day and age. And finally, thank you for your time and attention today. There is a paper coming out discussing this. It should be available soon at the Simpson Center's website. Thank you for your time.
That's just great. Thanks very much for your information, May. Super information and really clear slides as well to give us to picture the impacts, both short-term and long-term. So very interesting. We have a questions and answer period now. We have lots of time for that. And I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions, and we'll try and get to them. We have a couple of specific questions. They're about your comments on India as an exporter and importer. And there was the general comment that we don't necessarily see everything that is happening in the small cities, that the news particularly only covers the mega cities actually there, and that the total impacts of the pandemic because of that aren't really totally being seen. And so I guess I would ask a question about where we access our data on this area, and how good is it, or are there other sources, I guess?
Well, I mean, I didn't realize a lot of this is actually on the industry side. I think people who are involved in the industry know. I knew, for instance, I was doing some research on wheat production in India, and it's highly mechanized. Planting and harvesting is mechanized. But the fellow I was speaking to is an Indian academic, and he was saying basically, yes, but the supply chain doesn't work because it's all done by wheelbarrow at the rail yards. I didn't know that. So you do sort of need to, I believe the industry associations and then connections within country are going to be the ones to find out. We all know that the data on COVID-19 is going to be underreported because of undertesting. So you're going to look at, if it's big in the cities, it's going to be everywhere. Yeah, I think the best is industry associations and then industry contacts who are actually on the ground there. An academic in India will definitely know better than us here, because we are so isolated. We only see what we see in the media and what we can dig up on our own, and even then it's hard. You don't get the full picture. So cultivate, if the market, if that destination market, if it's India that you're interested in, try and connect with people on the ground there, or industries on the ground there in the specific commodity or product that you're interested there. Yeah, it's not easy. It really isn't.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So someone else asked a question about China in particular, and your recommendation was trying to really focus on following rules-based trade and as much globally as possible, and not use politics as a tool, but that just describes the opposite of China. And what is the impact of trying to do that with a country like China? And I guess how to best manage this? Do you have any ideas or thoughts?
China is complicated. It's very complicated. Since World War II, we have followed a rules-based WTO system of trade, because it's rules-based, it's predictable, it's based on law and regulations, and not sort of one-off, whatever you feel like doing. And that has actually made the world trade system, not just in agriculture, everything work. It's because that it's reliable and people are operating by the same set of rules, and you agree to work by the same set of rules, then businesses are willing to invest and ship and whatever and move things abroad. And because it's a risk, and you lose your investment, and you lose do you want to bear that risk if there's no predictability? China in the last few years, yes, it is a huge growing market. It's not sustainable. It's not food sustainable on its own. It must import. And all countries have been shipping to China because it's a growth market. They've got I don't know how many billion people and counting. And they are at their limit in terms of what they can produce. So as well, they're also getting their middle class is growing. And as people get higher incomes, they want more food, they want more diversity in their diets, and they want more interesting diets. The other side is there's always a risk. So if you speak to the canola producers here in Canada, because of the Menwenzhou Huawei issue and some other things, I mean, they just said no. And they couched it in terms of a sanitary phytosanitary issue, that there was a contaminant in our shipments, and they shut it down. And so all of our canola producers had to find new markets. So you take a risk of shipping to China, you could also have them slam the door in your face. So my recommendation is try and diversify your markets, but also have a backup plan. Let's look at the Australians right now. Like 2 months ago, they said that China didn't manage COVID-19 well and didn't inform the rest of the world. And they just randomly chose barley. And that's it. So if you happen to ship a product that China needs desperately, for instance, right now they need pork because their herd was decimated, their domestic herd was decimated because of Asian swine flu. they're probably not going to slam the door on pork. But if you're producing something that they don't believe is that essential, or they believe is politically vulnerable, then they will turn the screws on you. So be prepared for that kind of thing. And it could come out of left field, completely unpredictable. So I would say if you're going to ship to China, be aware that this can happen and have a backup plan. Industry associations should be aware of this and should be able to help be organized and prepare. Our industry associations have been working very hard at doing this.
So one of the things I saw when you were talking specifically about the beef impacts was you talked about Brazil being a major exporter as well. And you mentioned that Brazil has over 400 plants that have meat processing plants that have over 2,000 employees each.
Mm-hmm.
And Canada has maybe a handful of
three.
Yeah, of plants.
Three that export.
And so it shows me again, we as a country are a major, we export a major portion of our production, but on the global stage, we are, relatively speaking, we don't have as much power. So to me, this opportunity gives us a little bit more of that soft power, because right now there are opportunities that we wouldn't normally see because we are quite a small player in some ways. Exactly.
And I think too, what's happening in Brazil, I don't believe it's going to improve for quite a long time because of the government policies and combination of their infrastructure. So if workers in those plants are still getting sick in the long run or the medium run, where are they going to source new workers? Do they want to go to work? Even if you're designated an essential worker, it's going to be, labor is going to be an issue. And meat processing is a labor-intensive process. There's no way around it yet. They tried. There is no AI. There's no robotics available as yet. They're working on it, but the nature of what they do is very labor-intensive in close quarters. So how do you rejig a plant for social distancing? That means redesigning the entire plant. It's not going to do that. So as long as we maintain health and safety of our workers in our plants, and people know Canadian beef is known as high quality, safe, clean. That's why we had such growth in exports to Japan and South Korea and Asia in general, because they know of our quality. I think there is a significant opportunity there as long as we continue to mitigate COVID-19 in our plants. And so far, so good. There have not been any more outbreaks. It seems to be, and I'm not a beef industry expert. I don't know for sure. This is just what I understand is going on. They've adapted some of their processing to ensure that there is worker safety. So some of the more complicated cuts, they're not doing. That would require more labor steps, they're not doing. But the ones that are bigger and less complicated, they are focusing on. So I believe that this is an opportunity to increase our meat exports at some point. But sure, with the caveat of depending on where you're going, if it's going to China, there's always risk.
Yep. So you mentioned some of Canada's food supply chain really having a little bit of short-term pain from the COVID impacts and having to really survive through that in a healthy way in order to be able to take advantage of this continued market growth and some of the additional opportunities we have. Mm-hmm. And I think you've mentioned as maybe some of the most vulnerable or hardest hits is the beef industry, for example, with its held back cattle, the large numbers. Do you have any other examples of the most vulnerable? And also on a related note, what could be done to reduce some of that short-term pain that maybe hasn't been done yet?
Hogs as well, right? Any livestock, because what happens is our producers are spread out and whatever, and then they narrow into a funnel into processing. And when the plant shut down, it takes a long time to fix that backlog. So in the meantime, what's happened in the livestock industry is that those cattle and hogs are not going to processing. So everything from the processing plant back to the farmer, that includes the feedlot, finishing, and all everything backwards is held in a holding pattern. And while they're being held in a holding pattern, they need to be fed, they need to be taken care of, which costs everybody expenses, feeding expenses, maintenance expenses, rations, all that. And as well as an oversupply of animals now because there's such a backlog. So the price that they're going to get per animal is dropping. So what that industry needs is income support to help them ride it out until the backlog is caught up. Because in fact, there is going to be a spike in demand because of the shortage, but it's that backlog before the processing plant. So they're stuck in a bad spot, whether or not they can feed them. I mean, in the US, they're talking about culls. They've been culling pork and hogs for, since it all started, and it's just horrible. So meat and livestock is one very vulnerable one. And because the supply chain is complicated, it's to grow an animal from birth to your steak is a long, complicated, and a time-intensive supply chain, which makes it vulnerable. The other one is horticulture. When you plant asparagus, it has to be harvested by this. You've got a 3-week window or a 2-week window or whatever it is. And if you don't get your workers in to harvest it or plant or whatever that time-sensitive issue is, you've lost your crop. So any of the horticultural sort of more perishable crops and products were vulnerable. So I read about asparagus, berries in BC, the microgreen guys that grow the pretty little radish things on your steak in the restaurants. They're vulnerable. It's perishable within hours, and they couldn't ship it out. So and no consumer is going to pay $15 for a little pack of radish sprouts that was destined for restaurant trade. And ended up just rotting and throwing it out. They were burning mushrooms, the just seeded mushroom crop. They actually just had to burn it because there was nowhere to sell it. So this kind of stuff happened during the initial lockdowns because the loss of the food service entire supply demand was gone. So all those producers who did any of that ate their whole crop. That was ready to go or about to go or was about to be harvested. So income support for those kind of situations is all you can do until it rebounds, until everything opens up again.
Sure. So we have another question here. Is our current business model of mega-sized plants actually inefficient over the entire life cycle? And would it be more efficient to look at a larger number of plants that are mid-sized?
We did that in 2003 to 2005 during BSE. We lost because we still ship about 800,000 head of cattle to the US because we can't process it in time. And in Western Canada, we are pretty good at processing our hogs, but I know in Eastern Canada, they send about 40% of their hogs down to the US for processing because we don't have enough processing capacity. So it makes sense that people would think we should open up some more facilities here. And we actually did. So when the border was closed in 2003 to 2005 due to BSE, we had a whole bunch, hundreds of new little facilities open up. They're all gone now. I think there might be 1 or 2 specialty ones. There's lots of provincial abattoirs, but we only have 3 in the entire country that will process 80% of our meat. And they are the only ones that are certified by the federal government for exporting. Our provincial abattoirs are not certified because other foreign governments won't accept that certification. It has to be federal. So why don't we have more plants? Well, it's the largest plant in Canada is the one in High River. I don't remember if it's Tyson or JBS. I think it's Tyson.
Tyson, yeah.
Compared to the US, that is a small plant. Might be a medium-sized plant. So even our largest plant doesn't qualify in terms of volume and scale. One of those plants is, I think I saw the last number was 420 million to build. No one's going to build that. No one's going to invest in that here because you need to have the volume to turn it out to recoup your investment, and they're not doing it. So the other thing that's also an issue is after BSE, we opened all these plants up. And once the border reopened, they all went broke. They couldn't make a go of it because with BSE, we took a far more conservative approach to BSE. And this is not a judgment call. This is just what's my judgment call. This is just what's happened. In the US, so okay, BSE is caused by prions in cattle. There's 7 or 8 parts of the cow. And again, I'm not a beef expert. This is just what I sort of know. there's 7 or 8 parts of the cow that are known to carry the prions rubiaceae. In Canada, those 7 or 8 parts must be destroyed. They cannot become part of any food chain or anything. They are a waste product that must be disposed of. In Europe, those must be, actually, they take it one step further. They have to be incinerated. We are allowed to dispose, but not incinerate. In the US, those 7 or 8 parts actually can be used in pet food and fertilizer. So they're not a waste product. So they actually make revenue. An American friend of mine in the beef industry says we actually use every part of the cow except the moo. In Canada, we don't use the moo and we don't use those 7 or 8 parts. So there's a cost of disposal there that the US producers or US industry doesn't have to bear. So that cost, that regulation adds an additional cost that our facilities have to tolerate, which already in a cost competitive environment, we already have a higher cost infrastructure. That's why we don't have more plants.
Okay, great. I'm just noticing that it's 11:45 and this was supposed to be our closing time. So I will remind folks who are watching who have to go now that we will be sending out a link to the entire, to the group of the entire webinar to you in the next day or so. And there would be a link on our website as well. But what I'd like to suggest is we will continue to actually do a few more question and answers here for the next 10 or 15 minutes before we go, because we've still got May here.
Sure.
So we have another question kind of related to that. You had mentioned the different regulations in the different countries that are competitors. And someone asked about different government supports for agriculture needing to be competitive with other export nations. And I think it's both on the regulatory side of barriers, either creating barriers or removing barriers, or supports, creating supports, or perhaps not having credits or supports available. And how do you think Canada is doing in general in this area of supports, and how can we increase the conversation in an environment of large deficits? So they're thinking of monetary supports, I guess.
Yeah, I think we've done okay. I'm sure there are segments of the industry that will say, no, we're not doing okay. And I know the livestock industry is hurting badly. They need help. They needed help back in March, and how much more help, right? Whether or not that's forthcoming. They've gotten some assistance to bear the costs for now, but whether or not it wasn't enough when it first came, whether or not they're getting additional tranches of assistance, I don't know. Regulations, I don't know what's happened yet. Everybody is still scrambling. This is still very short term, still new. The pandemic is still brand new. It's been 7 months, but policy is a very slow moving glacier. I know that in, for instance, Ukraine and Russia, they put export restrictions on wheat right away. And they said, we are keeping all our wheat production at home to make sure we can feed our own people. So that was supposed to come off at the end of August, at the end of harvest season. I don't know if it has or not. I haven't followed up. So you can see how things will happen. Argentina could increase their export tax, and again, affect wheat exports there because they want to keep more wheat home. Who knows? We've got to monitor every country, every crop individually. It's a lot of work. So that's why and I know our industry associations are on top of it. Our Canadian Agri-Trade Export Alliance is really on top of it. So they're the ones who have the wherewithal to watch. An individual producer doesn't have time to do this. They don't, who can watch every market that they're shipping to. The industry associations are capable, with some support, some extra help from the government in that sense, I think will be most helpful, as well as short-term income support for those directly affected.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just another question in terms of the global markets for the various agriculture products. If Canada doesn't step up as much to meet some of the gaps that some of these countries have in market demand in agri-foods, where does the supply come from, and who are our major competitors, would you say?
That's quite complicated. It depends on the commodity, and it depends on, we produce a lot, and we ship to, depending on that commodity, we ship to different markets for that good. And then depending on that also commodity, our competitors change as well. So for wheat, it tends to be the US, the Australians, Argentina. Beef, it was Brazil, the US. I can pull up our paper. So, you know, in terms of horticultural products, we tend to ship some we ship a lot to Asia. Right now, canola, because it was shut out of China, we've been shipping a lot to Dubai, actually, where they're processing it into canola oil and then shipping it elsewhere. So it just depends on the commodity, and it depends on the commodity will dictate who our competitors are.
Okay.
Pulses and legumes, it's Australia, it's India. There are some other, you know, Middle Eastern, Indian subcontinent producers as well. It's just, you have to look at the trade data is available. You can look it up. It's basically what it comes down to. But we ship everywhere.
Yeah. In terms of the competition, what I know you listed, for example, in beef, we are a large marketer or producer and exporter, and so is Brazil, for example. What would the sustainability impacts and greenhouse gas emissions be? Like some of the countries that are our competition in some ways, so they have very similar regulations, or like Australia may, for example, but other countries are operating with very different regulatory systems and standards, and therefore different competitive base, actually.
Yeah, every country has chosen to operate their own sets of regulations. That is their sovereign right. Canada and Australia are comparable. We are known as clean producers, responsible producers with a traceable supply chain. And Canada specifically has done really well because of our policy reactions to BSE. We ensured to ensure that we could continue to export post BSE, that we had full traceability in our supply chains. We have environmental rules. We have everything. We've implemented a very reputable production regime. The Europeans are even more strict. So their cost structure is even higher because, again, if you have the more regulations you have, the more costs you have to bear and the more expensive the end product will be. So the EU as a bloc, as a trading bloc, has a far more restrictive regulatory regime than we do. And I'm speaking in generalities here. The Americans are known as having slightly different and less restrictive regulations than we have. Same with Brazil. So it just depends. But if they're focusing on a specific export market, that market may dictate what they want. So for instance, South Korea and Japan really like having traceability, where they can scan the QR code on that package of meat and say, oh, well, this came from Daisy the cow. And you could see that Daisy the cow actually like roamed free in a pasture and ate flowers for her whole life and was happy till the day she ended up on my plate. You know, those kind of markets can dictate what they want. And if you're a savvy marketer of your product, maybe that's what you will produce your product to that level. That's a marketing choice. So okay. Yeah, it can be quite complicated, but also very lucrative if you tap into what consumers are demanding. So environmental issues, greenhouse gas emissions, yeah, you could find a way to market that.
So we have one more question here, talking a bit more about jobs and agricultural temporary foreign worker jobs, immigrants. And given that employment opportunities for low to modest skilled jobs are disappearing in the manufacturing and the resource sectors, how can we justify temporary foreign workers at this time?
The problem is there's not a lot of Canadians that want to do this work. It's hard, it's manual labor, it's backbreaking. Our producers have been trying to hire local Canadians to do this, and nobody wants it. They will come and try, even if they can get applicants. People will come and try for 3 days and quit. And the second they can find something else, they go. It is work that we just don't want to do. Our domestic population does not want to do it. So our producers have been trying from day one to hire local Canadians. And no matter what income level or how dire straits they are in terms of employment, they don't want to do this work. So our producers have had no choice except to bring in people who are willing and used to working in really, really difficult conditions. backbreaking work. It's manual labor. You're crouched down. If you're harvesting berries, you're doing it by hand. You're crawling around in the field every day, all day for 15 hours a day, picking berries. People don't want to do it here.
Okay. So for the person who asked that question, I would actually direct them to our August 12th webinar as well, because the topic is actually temporary foreign workers in agriculture. So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up here. I don't see any more new questions. And I'm going to thank you, May, very much for providing your insights today. We really appreciated it. And thanks very much to our audience for joining us. Just a reminder, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the webinar as well, and also a survey. So we ask that you fill out the survey if you could. And again, if you have not already done so, I encourage you to register for our next 3 upcoming Simpson Center webinars that are in August. You can find the registration information on the School of Public Policy website if you click on the webinar tab, and you'll see it here as well when we sign off. On August 12th, we have a webinar on temporary foreign workers, and on August 20th, we have a panel discussion on beefing up the post-COVID economy with the livestock sector as a driver for growth in Canada. And then August 25th, we are fortunate enough to have a conversation with the Alberta Agriculture and Forestry Minister, Devin Dreeshen. So again, please register for those, and we'd love to hear from you and keep sending in those questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you.